The ink was still fresh on the Japanese officer's diary when he paused, pen hovering above the page. "No ordinary soldiers," he wrote, his script trembling slightly with unease. Across the humid expanse of the island, the first hints of movement betrayed the arrival of a force whose presence would soon rewrite his understanding of war. The men approaching were Americans, but not as he had known them. There was a weight in their step, a quiet certainty that suggested both preparation and purpose. A Marine platoon pushed forward through the jungle, the foliage so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Each step was deliberate, careful, yet unyielding. Leaves snapped softly under boots, but the rhythm of their advance held. Visibility shrank to a mere handful of steps, yet the men moved with a cohesion that made distance irrelevant. In that dense green, the air seemed alive with tension, the scent of damp earth mixing with the metallic tang of anticipation. Minutes passed before the first contact erupted. A shout, a volley of rifle fire, and the jungle came alive with motion and smoke. But even in the chaos, the Americans pressed on with surprising momentum. Where other units might falter, they adapted, flowing through the terrain like water finding a path. The Japanese forward observers, initially confident in their own prepared defenses, began reporting something that unsettled their superiors. Fire discipline, speed, and tactical coordination unlike anything seen in previous engagements. The platoon's advance was methodical. Riflemen laid down precision fire while bar teams moved in synchronized arcs, their bursts shaping the battlefield. Machine gun crews supported the advance, pinning targets with relentless accuracy. Every maneuver was calculated, every response instinctive yet disciplined. It was a choreography honed in training and hardened by resolve, one that left the defenders scrambling to find openings that did not exist. Commanders on the Japanese side slowly grasped the reality. These Marines fought differently. They did not panic under pressure. They did not yield ground. With each passing hour, the whispers among the ranks grew louder. A reputation was forming, born in the sweat and blood of this opening clash. These Americans did not break, and they did not retreat. And yet the battle was only beginning. Deep in the undergrowth, another platoon waited in silence, preparing to test the limits of this newfound reputation. The ambush came without warning. From the cover of the tangled underbrush, Japanese forces unleashed a sudden hail of rifle fire across an open stretch of terrain, catching the Marines in a rare moment of exposure. Yet even as bullets tore through the air, the Americans did not falter. Their response was immediate, controlled, and precise. Riflemen returned fire in disciplined volleys, while automatic weapons cut arcs of steel across the advancing enemy, reshaping the battlefield within seconds. Chaos existed, but it belonged to the attackers, not the defenders. Japanese non-commissioned officers recorded their growing disbelief. These Marines moved forward even when their ranks were pressed by overwhelming numbers. There was no hesitation, no instinctive retreat, only a relentless push coordinated by small unit leaders empowered to act without waiting for orders from above. Their judgment, formed in training and tempered by combat, manifested in moments of improvisation that were both daring and lethal. Where other units might crumble under the pressure, these men advanced, each decision a thread in a tapestry of controlled violence. The balance of close combat had shifted. The M1918 Browning automatic rifle, carried by teams trained to fire and support and suppress simultaneously, dominated the encounters at short range. Enemy soldiers found themselves pinned under withering fire, unable to close the distance or maneuver as they had in prior skirmishes. When the Japanese attempted a banzai charge, a tactic meant to overwhelm through sheer courage and shock, it collapsed within moments. The line disintegrated under the relentless rhythm of rifles and machine guns, leaving the attackers scattered and reeling. By mid-afternoon, a heavy silence settled over the contested ground. It was not the quiet of surrender, but of shock, the unspoken acknowledgement that the Americans were not cautious. They were unyielding. Commanders and soldiers alike felt a subtle, creeping fear, a realization that their previous assumptions about U.S. troops no longer applied. Japanese sitreps, usually confident and procedural, began to whisper a new truth. These troops are different. And yet, even as dread took root, the Marines pressed onward. In the shadows beyond the ridge, another wave of defenders was assembling, unaware that the momentum had already shifted irreversibly. The ambush came without warning. From the cover of the tangled underbrush, Japanese forces unleashed a sudden hail of rifle fire across an open stretch of terrain, catching the Marines in a rare moment of exposure. Yet even as bullets tore through the air, the Americans did not falter. Their response was immediate, controlled, and precise. Riflemen returned fire in disciplined volleys while automatic weapons cut arcs of steel across the advancing enemy, reshaping the battlefield within seconds. Chaos existed, but it belonged to the attackers, not the defenders. Japanese non-commissioned officers recorded their growing disbelief. These Marines moved forward even when their ranks were pressed by overwhelming numbers. There was no hesitation, no instinctive retreat, only a relentless push coordinated by small unit leaders empowered to act without waiting for orders from above. Their judgment, formed in training and tempered by combat, manifested in moments of improvisation that were both daring and lethal. Where other units might crumble under the pressure, these men advanced, each decision a thread in a tapestry of controlled violence. The balance of close combat had shifted. The M1918 Browning automatic rifle, carried by teams trained to fire and support and suppress simultaneously, dominated the encounters at short range. Enemy soldiers found themselves pinned under withering fire, unable to close the distance or maneuver as they had in prior skirmishes. When the Japanese attempted a banzai charge, a tactic meant to overwhelm through sheer courage and shock, it collapsed within moments. The line disintegrated under the relentless rhythm of rifles and machine guns, leaving the attackers scattered and reeling. By mid-afternoon, a heavy silence settled over the contested ground. It was not the quiet of surrender, but of shock, the unspoken acknowledgement that the Americans were not cautious. They were unyielding. Commanders and soldiers alike felt a subtle, creeping fear, a realization that their previous assumptions about U.S. troops no longer applied. Japanese sitreps, usually confident and procedural, began to whisper a new truth. These troops are different. And yet, even as dread took root, the Marines pressed onward. In the shadows beyond the ridge, another wave of defenders was assembling, unaware that the momentum had already shifted irreversibly. The Marines moved inland with a deliberate patience that belied their aggressiveness. Squads advanced in careful, coordinated waves, each element trained to infiltrate the dense jungle with precision. They used natural cover, contouring every slope and shadow, shifting silently between trees and undergrowth, while maintaining lines of sight and fields of fire. Every movement was rehearsed yet flexible, each squad aware of its place in the broader operation. To the Japanese observers, it seemed almost mechanical, but there was a human rhythm beneath the discipline, a blend of instinct and training that rendered the terrain itself an ally. Japanese officers recorded their mounting surprise. The Americans adapted far faster than expected, responding to ambushes and flanking maneuvers with improvisation that appeared preordained. Where prior encounters with U.S. troops had relied on predictable drills, this force adjusted seamlessly to the unforeseen. Mortar teams laid down suppressive fire while naval guns on offshore vessels fired spotting rounds with uncanny precision, as if the sea itself conspired with the infantry. The integration of land and naval firepower was not merely tactical. It was operational, a demonstration of coordination so fluid that the defenders struggled to predict where the next strike would fall. Rotation of units became a subtle weapon of its own. Observers noted how squads traded places without loss of momentum, allowing exhausted men to retreat briefly while fresh teams pressed the advance. In the same movements, Marines carried more than the typical infantry load. Grenades, additional ammunition, and automatic weapons filled every pack, every belt enabling sustained fire where Japanese units would quickly tire. Each man became a self-contained engine of combat, capable of both offense and defense simultaneously. Intelligence reports captured another revelation. These troops studied the terrain ruthlessly. Hills, ravines, and waterways were measured, memorized, and used to strategic effect. Every advance was preceded by quiet reconnaissance, every maneuver informed by knowledge as precise as it was deadly. The Empire's commanders slowly faced a sobering realization. Japan was no longer confronting a standard opponent. Across the Pacific, an enemy had been engineered for its harshest conditions, honed in training and tested in fire. And yet, as the Marines pressed deeper into the island, a silent tension hung in the air. For every foothold they claimed, the defenders wondered what new form of precision or discipline would strike next, unseen and unrelenting. Before 1942, the Japanese Empire carried a quiet certainty across its battlefields. Officers and instructors alike believed their infantry doctrine unrivaled in the art of close combat. Every drill, every exercise, reinforced the notion that the soldier's spirit was as lethal a weapon as any rifle or cannon. Their emphasis on cohesion, discipline, and unwavering obedience was more than training. It was a philosophy. Men were molded to act as one body, each heartbeat synchronized to the rhythm of the unit, ready to execute night assaults and shock attacks with precise timing and unflinching courage. The victories in China and Southeast Asia lent weight to this belief. Cities, villages, and river valleys had fallen to coordinated strikes and relentless pursuit, and the empire's soldiers had internalized each triumph as proof of their superiority. Within the barracks and training grounds, instructors recited the lesson again and again: courage under fire, decisiveness in the melee, and the inevitability of victory. Japanese strategy assumed that Western troops, unaccustomed to the brutal intimacy of bayonet fighting, would yield when confronted by the discipline and audacity of a united assault. Command believed that Americans, soft, individualistic, and reliant on machinery over cohesion, would falter under pressure, their morale brittle and their formations unstable. Doctrine did not merely consider morale as a factor, it elevated it to a weapon. The fear of breaking under concentrated assault was itself a tool of war. Japanese leaders envisioned the psychological collapse of the enemy before their physical bodies even faced the blade. In theory, this strategy was flawless. The empire's infantry, forged in the crucible of decades of ritualized training and battlefield success, would confront any foe with unshakable confidence, each man a component of a greater, unyielding machine. Yet, as the first reports trickled in from the Pacific Islands, assumptions began to strain. U.S. Marines, newly arrived and fully equipped, moved with a combination of discipline and adaptability that the Empire had not anticipated. They did not flinch under fire, did not break when pressed, and did not respond to shock attacks in the manner previously taught in textbooks and manuals. The arrival of these Americans, with their methodical advance, coordinated firepower, and independent small-unit decision-making, posed a quiet but profound challenge to doctrine. The men of the Empire realized, slowly and with mounting unease, that their expectations of fear, hesitation, and disorder might no longer hold true. Confidence, once absolute, now encountered an unfamiliar variable, an opponent designed to endure, to adapt, and to press relentlessly where others would falter. What had been a doctrine built on certainty now faced its first test against a force that refused the scripts of previous encounters. And in the command rooms and field posts, officers began to wonder how their perfected strategies would fare against soldiers who seemed not to bend, not to tire, and not to fear. By the time the first volleys met across the jungle and sand, the Empire's certainty, the quiet arrogance of years of unchallenged victories, stood on the brink of being measured against a new reality. The Marines who stepped onto the beaches had been forged by decades of expeditionary warfare, shaped by harsh discipline and relentless training. From the Pacific atolls to the deserts of the Caribbean and the coasts of Central America, their predecessors had honed techniques in environments as unforgiving as the islands they now faced. This was not a collection of soldiers thrown together in haste. It was a force meticulously cultivated, its doctrine tempered by experience and the hard lessons of countless small wars. Each man understood not only his duty but the broader rhythm of combat, the invisible currents of terrain, timing, and fire. Their preparation fused marksmanship with independent action and the principles of amphibious assault. Squads moved like living instruments, each rifle, machine gun, and automatic weapon an extension of the unit's intent. Leaders at the lowest levels, the non-commissioned officers, were not merely transmitters of orders but combat architects in miniature, capable of orchestrating movement and fire under the most chaotic conditions. In every engagement, a platoon could fragment into small, autonomous teams without losing cohesion, their initiative supported by doctrine rather than hindered by hierarchy. It was a philosophy rooted in the conviction that every Marine, regardless of rank, was a rifleman first, a principle that produced extraordinary consistency and reliability on the battlefield. Japanese officers, accustomed to Western troops whose nerves frayed under sustained fire, found themselves confounded. These Americans moved calmly beneath the rain of artillery and mortar, returning fire with measured precision, coordinating suppressive barrages while advancing steadily. Where the Empire had assumed fear and hesitate. On would dictate the tempo of battle, the Marines imposed their own rhythm. Each assault became an exercise in controlled violence, each defense a calculated demonstration of endurance. The psychological impact of such composure was profound, shaking assumptions built over years of prior encounters. Coordination extended beyond the infantry line. Naval guns, once instruments of distant bombardment, were integrated into the advance with seamless precision. Spotters relayed corrections from forward teams, and shells fell with uncanny timing, shaping the battlefield in favor of the assaulting Marines. The combination of land and sea firepower created an operational reach that left Japanese defenders struggling to respond. Artillery became not only a support tool, but an extension of the Marine ethos itself, flexible, accurate, and inexorably advancing alongside the infantry. As the hours and days passed, the Empire was forced to confront a harsh truth. Their assumptions about the American character, the perception of weakness, individualism, and hesitation, were profoundly flawed. These Marines were disciplined, adaptable, and fearless in ways that textbooks could not predict. Every advance, every defensive stand, challenged the doctrines that had guided the Empire for decades. In the quiet aftermath of each engagement, officers began to whisper an acknowledgement long avoided. This was not an enemy to be measured by prior experience, but a force crafted for victory under conditions that had once been thought unassailable. And yet the islands held more secrets. Beyond the next ridge, more tests awaited, and the Marines, steady, methodical, unyielding, were only beginning to impose their ethos on the battlefield. The Japanese infantry, steeped in a tradition of shock and decisive assault, sought to shatter American morale with charges designed to overwhelm through sheer audacity. They advanced across the dense undergrowth, bayonets fixed, voices raised in battle cries meant to unnerve and intimidate. For decades, such tactics had succeeded in China and Southeast Asia, and commanders expected the same result here. They believed fear could precede fire, that spirit could substitute for superior firepower. Yet the Marines met each charge not with panic, but with a disciplined storm of layered automatic fire. Riflemen, bar teams, and machine gunners created fields of fire that intersected with lethal precision. Each volley did not merely stop the attackers. It reshaped the battlefield, forcing the Japanese to adapt mid-stride or collapse entirely. Where enemy doctrine relied on psychological pressure, the Americans relied on preparation, positioning, and relentless execution. Their calmness under assault began to erode expectations built over years of previous victories. Night, once Japan's domain, offered little advantage. Marine patrols moved silently through the shadows, trained for darkness, each man aware of angles, approaches, and likely enemy positions. The glow of a distant flare or the flash of a muzzle revealed targets that had assumed concealment would grant surprise. Handheld radios amplified the effect, allowing squads to coordinate movements and fire across terrain that would have confounded any less disciplined force. Where Japanese units had once dictated the rhythm of engagement under cover of darkness, the Marines imposed their own tempo, an invisible hand guiding precision strikes across the blackened landscape. Ambushes, obstacles, and prepared kill zones, the tools of Japanese ingenuity, were met with counter-ambush drills learned and refined in pre-war service. Every trap was anticipated, every chokepoint approached with methodology rather than recklessness. Observers noted a chilling efficiency. The Marines learned from each encounter in real time, adjusting formations and fire patterns with an instinctive understanding of combined arms and small unit coordination. Both sides were quick studies, but the gap in adaptation became evident. Where Japan relied on doctrine honed over decades, the Americans operated as a system, an integrated whole in which each man, weapon, and maneuver was part of a broader pattern. The Empire began to understand the unsettling truth. These Marines were not merely opponents to be beaten or intimidated. They were a living, functioning system, engineered to endure, to adapt, and to dominate the environment in which they fought. And as dawn approached over the bloodied island soil, it became clear that this clash of doctrines was not merely a contest of courage or strength. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of war, one rigid and tested, the other disciplined, flexible, and unyielding. The first major test of American resolve unfolded along the Tenaru and Matanikau rivers, where the dense jungle and treacherous swamps became the stage for a confrontation that would rewrite assumptions about combat in the Pacific. For weeks, the Japanese had moved with confidence, expecting to encounter the hesitant, disorganized opposition their doctrine predicted. They believed that well-timed charges and relentless night attacks would break the thin line of American defenders. Night after night, Japanese units surged across the mud and undergrowth, their bayonets glinting under the flickering light of flares and the rare moonbeam. They struck with the ferocity of men convinced of inevitable victory, their shouts intended to shake the Marines' courage. Yet every assault met the cold, disciplined response of a force unshaken by expectation. Overlapping fields of fire, prearranged in meticulous planning, met each wave. Riflemen, bar teams, and machine gun crews worked in concert, their combined fire turning the tide of individual courage against the certainty of massed assault. Machine guns, M1917s and M1919s, became instruments of both destruction and revelation. Japanese doctrine, built over decades of close combat, had never accounted for a defensive array so dense and coordinated. Where they had anticipated quick penetration and the collapse of morale, they found gaps in their lines carved by sustained fire, their formations shredded under the methodical, relentless rhythm of American weaponry. Each burst was precise, each firing position calculated, and each volley reinforced a lesson the Empire would struggle to unlearn. Raw courage alone could not overcome a system trained to respond, adapt, and endure. The Marines endured hardships that might have broken lesser troops. Hunger gnawed at their strength, disease thinned their ranks, and isolation from resupply created a tension that weighed as heavily as any rifle. Yet they did not retreat. They did not flinch. They held ground with a quiet tenacity that spoke not of heroism, but of preparation, discipline, and shared purpose. Every advance, every suppressed enemy movement, was proof that these were men trained not only to fight, but to survive where others would crumble. Japanese survivors later reported shock that defied the conventions they had relied upon. They spoke of soldiers who fought with the same intensity day after day, night after night, who seemed to operate without the fear, hesitation, or fatigue that had historically defined Western troops. The psychological impact was profound. Their own doctrine, once a map of assured victory, now appeared inadequate, unable to predict or control the outcome. Guadalcanal, a remote island that might have been a stepping stone to broader conquest, became instead a crucible where the Empire first confronted the limits of its assumptions. Morale, the linchpin of the Japanese approach, began to fracture. Reports trickled back to headquarters noting the tenacity and coordination of the Americans, the unyielding discipline under fire, and the uncanny integration of weapons and men into a functioning whole. The phrase, "they do not break," began to circulate quietly, a warning whispered between officers and soldiers alike. Guadalcanal was no longer merely a tactical objective. It was the first theater in which Japanese confidence, nurtured over years of victories across Asia, began to crack beneath the weight of a disciplined, adaptive opponent. And as dawn broke over the rivers, the mud, and the bloody jungle paths, both sides paused in the silence between volleys. The Marines prepared for the next wave with the same measured resolve, while the Empire confronted a hard truth. They had met a force that was more than a collection of men. They had encountered a system, disciplined and unrelenting, capable of enduring both the night and the storm. The jungle of Guadalcanal became both battlefield and teacher. The Marines, confronted with terrain thick with vines, mud, and hidden ravines, refined their tactics through a relentless regimen of trial and error. Each patrol revealed new hazards, camouflaged positions, sudden ravines, and sniper nests that had gone unnoticed in maps and reconnaissance. Lessons were learned quickly, sometimes at terrible cost, as men fell to the unseen and the unexpected. Yet with every failure came an adjustment, each mistake cataloged, analyzed, and transformed into procedure. Patience became a weapon. Small squads learned to stalk Japanese positions silently, moving through the dense undergrowth with measured steps and controlled breathing. Every movement was deliberate, every pause considered. Marines observed patterns in enemy behavior, timing patrol rotations, and learning when to press and when to hold. Night, once the domain of Japanese advantage, was now an extension of American adaptability. Darkness no longer hid danger. It became a tool of opportunity, allowing Marines to close in with precision rather than desperation. Flamethrower and demolition teams emerged as indispensable assets. They moved ahead of the main line, rooting out defenders entrenched in bunkers, caves, and reinforced positions that conventional assault could not overcome. The hiss of flame and the crack of explosives shattered the illusion of safety, forcing hidden troops into exposure or surrender. These tools, combined with disciplined rifle fire and supporting automatic weapons, allowed the Marines to maintain the initiative even in the most hostile terrain. Japanese observers, often recording these encounters in hurried diaries, noted the Americans' mastery of combined arms in miniature. Riflemen, bar gunners, mortars, and scouts worked as a cohesive unit, each element anticipating the other. Suppressive fire, reconnaissance, and maneuver were integrated at the squad and platoon level, creating a system of war that seemed greater than the sum of its parts. The Empire had never encountered an opponent so capable of blending individual initiative with rigid cohesion. Medical and logistical innovations quietly amplified this advantage. Casualty evacuation, once chaotic and slow under fire, became streamlined. Wounded Marines were rapidly removed from the line and replaced with fresh troops, allowing units to maintain strength far longer than their Japanese counterparts. Every improvement, no matter how small, reinforced endurance, resilience, and morale, creating a cumulative effect on the battlefield that the enemy could neither anticipate nor easily counter. Japanese diaries reflect a mixture of respect and unease. One officer wrote simply, "They fight like hunters." The metaphor was telling. Americans did not merely advance. They tracked, observed, and struck with patience and precision. The Marines' willingness to innovate in the face of danger, to blend tools, tactics, and timing, became a quiet but decisive advantage. Their adaptations, invisible to those expecting conventional combat, reshaped the conflict in microcosm, allowing a relatively small force to dominate terrain far larger than their numbers would suggest. By the end of each engagement, the lesson was clear. Guadalcanal had become a laboratory of war, and the Marines were its practitioners. Adaptation, discipline, and innovation were no longer abstract qualities. They were weapons as effective as any rifle or mortar. For the Japanese, the realization slowly took hold. These men were not only surviving the storm of jungle combat, they were mastering it, turning every challenge into an opportunity, every encounter into evidence of an enemy unlike any they had faced before. And as the undergrowth settled after another firefight, the Marines paused only briefly. New patrols moved forward, flamethrowers and scouts ready, applying the lessons of yesterday to the battles yet to come. Innovation, quiet and relentless, had become their most potent weapon. As the war spread across the Pacific, the Marines evolved from competent infantry into a force meticulously engineered for amphibious warfare. Divisions were organized not only for attack, but for seamless integration of land, sea, and air, a system in which every man, weapon, and vehicle served the broader rhythm of assault. Each landing became a demonstration of preparation and coordination, the result of years of doctrine refined through trial, combat, and relentless training. Japanese defenders quickly discovered that no beach could be approached without enduring a preliminary storm of naval gunfire. Cruisers, destroyers, and battleships opened fire in sustained barrages, shaping the terrain before the first Marine set foot on sand or coral. Where previous invasions might have allowed defenders to hold their positions against uncoordinated assaults, these preparatory strikes softened obstacles, disrupted fortifications, and created corridors of opportunity that only disciplined attackers could exploit. The Empire had never faced a force so thorough, so precise, and so unflinching in its opening moves. Amphibious tractors, armored and resilient, carried troops through the surf even as shells struck around them. Men disembarked under fire, advancing with rifles ready and eyes trained on the enemy. The combination of mobility, protection, and coordination gave the Marines a foothold that would have been impossible for earlier forces, allowing them to establish positions under conditions that might have destroyed less prepared units. Each successful landing reinforced the principle that preparation, technology, and doctrine could converge to overcome numerical or positional disadvantage. Small unit cohesion became the silent backbone of every operation. Squads trained to operate independently within the larger assault executed maneuvers that mirrored the intent of the entire division. Leaders at the platoon and squad levels made rapid decisions in complex terrain, improvising within doctrine while maintaining cohesion. Even when disrupted by terrain, enemy fire, or logistical delay, these units functioned almost as autonomous engines of war, advancing, suppressing, and adapting with remarkable efficiency. Marine aviation layered yet another element onto this integrated assault. LT, dive bombers, fighters, and close air support coordinated with forward observers on the ground, delivering precision strikes that shattered previously unassailable defenses. The Japanese, accustomed to predicting the tempo of infantry movements, were confronted with an opponent whose reach extended vertically as well as horizontally. Defensive positions that had once relied on concealment and massed fire were exposed to a multi-dimensional force operating with unprecedented synchronization. Reports filtered back to Japanese commanders describing men who fought through exhaustion, hunger, and stress with unshakable tactical clarity. The audacity of the Americans, combined with their discipline and adaptability, confounded expectations. Units that should have faltered instead pressed forward, leveraging combined arms, reconnaissance, and small unit initiative to maintain momentum even under the heaviest fire. The result was the emergence of the Marine machine, a force whose efficiency and precision became a symbol of fear among the defenders. It was not simply the men, nor the weapons, nor the vehicles. It was the system itself, coordinated, adaptive, and unyielding. Beaches, ridges, and jungle passes were overcome not through luck, but through the integration of doctrine, training, and innovation. To the Japanese, it was a force that fought like a single organism, relentless in its advance, unbroken by fatigue, and terrifying in its predictability of success. And yet, as another island's shore came into view on the horizon, the Marines prepared to land once more, armored tractors ready, artillery calibrated, and squads poised to operate in harmony. The machine had learned from every encounter, every obstacle, every ambush, and it would carry those lessons forward into the battles yet to come. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, surveyed the coral atoll with quiet certainty. "They cannot take Tarawa in 100 years, he promised his superiors, the words carrying the weight of decades of defensive doctrine and the confidence of men who believed in the unassailability of fortified islands. His men, entrenched in bunkers, pillboxes, and reinforced emplacements, had spent months preparing for the inevitable assault. Every sandbar, every reef, every patch of coral had been surveyed, mined, and defended with painstaking attention. In his mind, the Americans approaching the lagoon were destined to falter before even reaching the shore. But the Marines did not falter. The assault began under conditions that would have broken any conventional force. Tides misjudged, waves lapped higher than anticipated, and landing craft ground to a halt on submerged reefs. Men waded through waist and chest-deep water, their packs heavy with ammunition, rifles, and flamethrowers. Bullets struck the surf around them, cutting swathes through the advancing lines. Despite the chaos, the squads pressed forward, exploiting every dip in terrain, every slight shadow for cover. Forward momentum, discipline, and training held them together as the sea itself threatened to stall the attack. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as Americans crawled through the surf under direct machine gun fire, each man moving with an almost mechanical determination. The enemy had anticipated hesitation, fear, and the instinct to seek cover, yet these Marines seemed immune to instinct itself, advancing methodically despite the devastation surrounding them. The combination of small unit initiative, suppressive fire, and sheer determination allowed them to close distances that had been calculated as impassable. Each step toward the fortified positions was a lesson in the cost of underestimating an opponent engineered for both endurance and aggression. Pillboxes fell not to luck, but to preparation and audacity. Explosives were planted at point-blank range. Flamethrowers spat fire into bunkers, forcing defenders to retreat or perish. Marines moved in deliberate waves, supporting one another as teams cleared each fortification in turn. The sound of hissing flames, detonating charges, and the disciplined rhythm of rifle fire became the soundtrack of a siege that defied expectation. Where the defenders anticipated terror and retreat, they encountered methodical, relentless aggression. Astonishment ran through the Japanese ranks. Survivors reported men who continued to fight despite wounds that would have ended others' participation. Each casualty was replaced, each position reinforced, yet the momentum never slowed. Tactical clarity, coordination, and sheer endurance combined to create a force that moved with the inevitability of a machine while retaining the cunning of a predator. Tarawa, once considered an impregnable stronghold, became a proving ground for the ethos of the Marine Corps. By the end of the first day, the Empire confronted an uncomfortable truth. Shibasaki's promises, the doctrine of impregnable fortifications, and the years of defensive preparation were insufficient against a force trained to integrate firepower, initiative, and resilience at every level. The Marines did not merely assault the island. They imposed a system of war that the defenders had never encountered, one in which adaptation, coordination, and endurance outweighed entrenched certainty. Tarawa entered the record books not just as a tactical engagement, but as the moment Japan fully understood what the Marine Corps represented. Discipline hardened into machine-like precision. Small unit initiative became a force multiplier. Each landing, each breach, each advance etched a warning into the memory of the Empire. These men would not falter, would not retreat, and could endure what others could not imagine. And as the sun sank over the shattered reefs and smoking pillboxes, the Marines paused only briefly, already preparing for the next objective. In their wake, Tarawa remained, a name burned into memory, a warning written in blood and courage, and the first unmistakable signal that the Marine Corps had arrived as a force that would redefine warfare in the Pacific. The beaches of Saipan were alive with fire long before the first Marine boots touched the sand. Officers, observing the initial waves from landing craft, feared the worst. Intelligence predicted heavy resistance, but the reality surpassed even the most pessimistic estimates. Machine guns tore the surf to ribbons, artillery cut arcs of death across the coastline, and mortars rained destruction into every shallow channel. Some commanders whispered that as many as 50% of the first assaulting force would fall before reaching the inland defenses. Yet, the Marines pressed forward, each man conditioned to act with discipline under conditions that would have shattered any lesser formation. Japanese forces, convinced that sheer mass could still break an enemy, launched counterattacks of unprecedented scale. Thousands surged forward in tightly packed formations, relying on shock and morale to carry them through the hail of bullets and shells. The defenders had honed the banzai charge into both ritual and weapon, a culmination of doctrine that had succeeded countless times before. But against the Marines of Saipan, the calculation failed. The Americans had learned from every island, every reef, every embattled shoreline. Their response was immediate, coordinated, and devastating. Artillery, tanks, and naval gunfire were synchronized with an efficiency that astonished observers. Spotters in the hills, on ships, and embedded within infantry units relayed corrections with a precision that made the battlefield a controlled system of destruction. When Japanese forces pressed, they were met not by piecemeal defense, but by the combined might of an integrated force. Waves of attackers were shredded before they could reach the first line of Marines, each volley reinforcing the harsh lesson that traditional mass assault was no longer a viable strategy against this opponent. Dismounted Marines moved inland with methodical precision through cane fields and the labyrinth of volcanic caves. Each squad acted as both scout and suppressive element, maintaining formations that allowed fire to cover movement while minimizing exposure. Terrain that should have favored defenders, the thick cane, uneven ridges, and hidden caves, was neutralized by training and coordination. Marines communicated through radios, hand signals, and prearranged patterns, closing gaps that might have been exploited in earlier wars. The largest banzai charge of the Pacific War came next. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops surged forward in a desperate gamble, hoping to pierce the American line through sheer determination. They met immovable firepower instead. Bar gunners, machine gun crews, and rifle squads combined into lethal intersections of fire. Artillery rounds landed precisely in the ranks, naval gunfire carved corridors of destruction, and tanks annihilated the unshielded. Within hours, the charge collapsed completely, leaving devastation and silence where a force had once believed victory certain. Japanese commanders, forced to observe from forward positions and scattered posts, witnessed the annihilation of an entire division. Doctrine, morale, and strategy, everything that had once dictated battlefield success, had failed in the face of disciplined, integrated, and adaptive American forces. Confidence, once absolute, fractured in real time, as officers realized that the war they had trained to fight no longer existed in the form they had expected. Saipan fell not simply as a tactical victory, but as a strategic watershed. The perimeter of Japanese defense in the Central Pacific began to collapse. The myth of invincibility, reinforced by decades of victories, was shattered. In its place stood a new reality, a Marine Corps capable of absorbing fire, adapting, coordinating, and annihilating even the most determined counterattack. The Empire learned that its traditional doctrines, mass assault, reliance on morale, and shock tactics, could no longer hold against a force engineered for endurance, precision, and relentless advance. As the smoke lifted over the bloodied beaches and shattered cane fields, Marines prepared to press onward, their momentum unbroken, their system intact. Saipan was more than a victory. It was a warning, a confirmation of what the Marine Corps represented. A machine of discipline, coordination, and inexorable power that would define the next phase of the Pacific War. Iwo Jima rose from the Pacific like a blackened sentinel, its volcanic slopes carved into a fortress designed to kill every invader. Concrete bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and concealed artillery positions transformed the island into a labyrinth of lethal intent. Every ridge, every crater, every scarred slope was a deliberate obstacle, engineered to funnel attackers into zones of concentrated fire. Japanese planners believed that any landing force would be exhausted and broken before reaching the heart of the defenses. Yet the Marines advanced with silent resolve, step by step, through interlocking fields of fire that would have crushed less disciplined troops. Riflemen, bar gunners, and machine gun teams moved in concert, each aware of the protective fire offered by comrades and the lethal reach of supporting units. Movement was deliberate, rehearsed, and adaptive, exploiting every fold of terrain, every shadow, every crest that offered momentary concealment. They did not hesitate. They did not pause to mourn the fallen. Progress was measured not in fear or fatigue, but in yards gained and positions seized. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as the Americans dug in immediately after every advance. Each foothold gained was fortified, fields of fire recalculated, and observation posts manned with relentless attention. Entrenchment was instantaneous, transforming small gains into strongholds capable of absorbing counterattacks. It was a rhythm of action and reaction, a cycle that eroded the defenders' expectation that the enemy would tire, hesitate, or falter under constant fire. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads became indispensable tools in the assault. Underground tunnel networks, previously assumed impregnable, were reduced to rubble as fire and explosives forced defenders into exposure or submission. Each breach was precise and methodical, a blend of training and courage that left Japanese officers reassessing every assumption about American tactics. Where doctrine had emphasized avoidance of prepared positions or reliance on artillery, the Marines turned doctrine into execution, integrating weapons, men, and terrain into a system of relentless pressure. Casualties mounted with every advance. Blood and smoke stained the volcanic sand, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the ridges and tunnels. Yet discipline never fractured. Even amid devastation, squads maintained formation, leaders made rapid tactical decisions, and firepower was applied with meticulous coordination. Fear and exhaustion were present, but they did not dictate action. Training and ethos carried each Marine forward. Japanese officers, recording what they could in journals and field notes, noted the uncanny composure of their adversaries. "They fight as if already resigned to death," one wrote, capturing a phenomenon that combined courage, calculation, and the inexorable acceptance of sacrifice. It was a level of resolve that transcended individual bravery. It was institutional, systemic, and terrifying in its predictability. Iwo Jima solidified the Marines' reputation as a force capable of taking any objective, regardless of cost. Every bunker reduced, every tunnel neutralized, every ridge seized was a testament not to chance, but to preparation, discipline, and integration of tactics. Across the volcanic island, the pattern became unmistakable. These were not men who simply reacted to fire. They imposed a system of war, one in which adaptation, coordination, and sheer will fused into a machine that could endure, absorb, and advance under conditions that had once seemed impossible. And as the blackened slopes smoldered with spent ordnance and shattered positions, the Marines paused only briefly. New objectives loomed beyond the ridges, and the lessons learned in fire, smoke, and cratered ground would carry forward. Iwo Jima was not merely a battle. It was the moment the Marine Corps was defined, a demonstration to the Empire that no fortress, no doctrine, and no fear could halt a force engineered to persist and prevail. Reports began to circulate with increasing frequency, the kind that commanders had long avoided. The Marines were not just soldiers. They were the most formidable American formation the Empire had ever faced. Accounts came from survivors, from scouts and officers who had endured direct contact, and from forward observers who had watched lines of men advance with precision that seemed unnatural. Every story shared the same pattern: unbroken squads moving under fire, coordinated, adaptive, and relentless. Survivors described the fear that gripped them at the first sign of a Marine squad advancing. The movement was slow, deliberate, and synchronized, each man in step with the others, each rifle, bar, and machine gun working in harmony. To those on the receiving end, it was as though they were hearing not men, but a force with weight and intent, methodically closing the distance with inexorable pressure. Where previous American units had been assumed hesitant or pliable, these troops projected inevitability, an unstoppable presence that compressed space and shattered expectation. Naval gunfire, coordinated with ground advances, compounded the effect. Offshore, cruisers and destroyers executed barrages with uncanny timing, supporting every maneuver of the infantry with fire that struck with both precision and psychological impact. What had once been considered the singular advantage of entrenched defenders, the combination of prepared positions and morale, was neutralized by integration and foresight. The Marines made firepower, coordination, and endurance indistinguishable from methodical strategy, leaving the defenders scrambling to react to a force that refused to be shaken or broken. Japanese doctrine, long rooted in assumptions about morale, shock tactics, and the limits of human endurance, began to fracture under the weight of experience. Traditional beliefs, that Western troops would falter under concentrated pressure, that moral fortitude could substitute for training, that spiritual preparation would outmatch bullets and explosives, were confronted by the stark evidence of battlefield reality. Commanders who had relied upon these precepts were forced to acknowledge a simple truth. These Marines could endure, adapt, and press relentlessly where others would retreat. Even the myth of spiritual superiority, once considered the cornerstone of imperial confidence, faltered beneath the weight of observation. Officers quietly recorded instances in which Marines advanced through hailstorms of fire, absorbed punishment, and reconstituted units in the midst of chaos. Traditional markers of fear, hesitation, or collapse were absent. The battlefield itself had become a mirror reflecting the inadequacy of prior assumptions. Privately, many officers questioned what they had long believed about American character. The notion that these troops were soft, individualistic, or incapable of sustained cohesion was now untenable. Where previously they had relied on massed courage, ritualized assaults, or the psychological weight of perceived invincibility, they now faced a formation that combined discipline, initiative, and relentless integration into a machine of war. Respect, though grudging, became inevitable. Across islands, reefs, and ridges, one lesson crystallized with clarity. The Marines had earned every inch of territory, every advance, and every victory not through luck or circumstance, but through method, preparation, and execution. Reports, journals, and whispered conversations all echoed a new reality. This was a force to be measured differently, feared appropriately, and never underestimated. Psychological domination, once assumed inherent to the Empire's offensive doctrine, had shifted. In its place stood a grudging acknowledgement of the Marines' discipline, coordination, and unrelenting capability, a recognition that would shape the Empire's approach for the remainder of the Pacific War. And as the smoke of battle drifted across shattered beaches and cratered hills, the realization settled quietly into the minds of Japanese officers. The enemy was no longer merely men. They were a system, precise and disciplined, and every inch they gained had been carved through determination, training, and unbroken resolve. Decades after the last shot of the Pacific War, post-war interviews revealed a striking and repeated sentiment among Japanese veterans: surprise at the tactical flexibility of the American Marines. Men who had been trained to anticipate hesitation, to exploit fear, and to outmaneuver weakness found themselves confronted by a force that seemed to defy expectation at every turn. The memory of those encounters lingered, etched into the consciousness of soldiers who had faced bullets, fire, and flame, with only the certainty of doctrine as their guide. Many recalled the uncanny precision of Marines even when wounded. Where ordinary soldiers might falter or retreat under pain, these men continued to advance, adjusting positions, recalculating angles of fire, and maintaining cohesion with their squads. Injuries slowed them only slightly. Discipline, training, and esprit de corps carried them forward. Observers could not understand how combatants could endure the attrition of heat, disease, fatigue, and enemy fire, while still executing their maneuvers with methodical accuracy. Why? Veterans spoke of the shock inspired by Americans who mastered jungle warfare with startling rapidity. Dense undergrowth, uneven terrain, and hidden obstacles that had traditionally favored the defenders offered no lasting advantage. Marines adapted their movement, their fire patterns, and their small unit tactics within hours of engagement. They integrated reconnaissance, suppression, and coordinated assault in ways that seemed almost instinctive. Japanese soldiers remembered thinking, repeatedly, that these were not ordinary troops. They were predators shaped to thrive in the environment the empire had long considered its own domain. Documents from the period, captured reports, and internal assessments reveal a grudging admiration for the Marines' ability to combine raw firepower with calm discipline. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and rifles were integrated into an operational rhythm, allowing even small squads to function as self-contained systems capable of coordinated strikes. Observers noted that American forces did not simply respond to enemy movement. They dictated it, controlling the tempo of battle through precision, coordination, and a persistent psychological pressure. The effect on Japanese strategic thinking was profound. Generals, planners, and analysts studied the operational patterns of Marine divisions for decades after the war, seeking lessons from landings at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. Training manuals, simulations, and war games incorporated reflections on American adaptation, small unit autonomy, and the integration of firepower across infantry, armor, and aviation. The Marines' influence persisted not in victories alone, but in the careful reconsideration of doctrine, strategy, and the limits of human endurance under fire. The psychological imprint of those encounters reverberated through generations. Soldiers recalled fear tempered by respect, astonishment that tactical flexibility could coexist with unwavering discipline, and the quiet, immutable understanding that the Americans had not merely survived. They had mastered, imposed, and endured. Across the Pacific, in memoirs and personal journals, the refrain returned again and again. These were opponents who would take an objective regardless of cost, a force that transformed every battlefield into a test of human and organizational limits. A silent acknowledgement emerged within the ranks and strategy rooms of the post-war empire. The Marines had forced a reevaluation of the entire war. Every assumption about Western weakness, doctrinal predictability, and the interplay of morale and firepower had been challenged, often brutally. The lessons of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima were not lost. They became a lens through which subsequent generations of Japanese strategists examined conflict, adaptation, and the enduring nature of disciplined, integrated forces. And as the memories of the islands settled into history, one truth persisted. The Marine Corps had not only fought battles, but had reshaped the perception of what it meant to endure, to coordinate, and to prevail. Their legacy, silent but unmistakable, became a standard by which opponents measured themselves for decades to come. In hindsight, the fear did not stem from sheer numbers, nor from the size of the force, nor from the individual courage of any single Marine. It emerged from something deeper, something more precise: method. The Americans moved, struck, and adapted as a unified organism. Every man had been trained not just to fight, but to think, to anticipate, and to act in concert with his comrades. Each advance, each suppression of fire, each coordinated maneuver was the product of discipline, training, and an unyielding philosophy that elevated the act of war beyond instinct or impulse. Marines functioned as extensions of one another, a living system in which every rifle, bar, and machine gun was synchronized into a rhythm that dictated the battlefield. Units advanced with deliberation, yet no hesitation. When one squad engaged, the supporting elements anticipated the response of the enemy, creating overlapping fields of fire that shaped the terrain to their advantage. Their doctrine evolved faster than the Empire's ability to counter it. Lessons learned on one island were immediately applied on the next, and the enemy, once confident in their assumptions about American tactics, was forced to adapt in real time, often too late. They embodied endurance without bravado. Exhaustion, heat, hunger, disease, and fear were constant companions, yet these men did not falter. They pressed forward with precision without cruelty, applying measured force that neutralized positions efficiently without indulgence or waste. Flamethrowers, explosives, artillery, and mortars were not instruments of terror. They were tools of execution, employed with exactitude to achieve objectives rather than to shock or intimidate beyond necessity. In every engagement, I demonstrated that a force could be deadly without surrendering its discipline, lethal without surrendering its humanity. For the Japanese defenders, the realization came gradually, often in whispers of incredulity. This was not merely an army to be beaten by morale, by shock, or by superior numbers. This was a system, a force capable of sustaining itself under fire, of coordinating attacks and defenses in a manner that seemed almost preordained, of taking the last objective even when the cost was visible and immediate. Every island, every fortified ridge, every bloodied beach offered proof. These were opponents who would endure, adapt, and persist where others would falter. Respect replaced underestimation. Confidence, once absolute, yielded to a cautious wariness as commanders recognized that their previous assumptions about Western weakness, about American fear of attrition, about limits of endurance, were flawed. The Marines had demonstrated again and again that they could fight through fire, darkness, and exhaustion without losing cohesion or clarity. Each engagement reinforced the growing acknowledgement that the Marines were not a temporary obstacle. They were the standard against which the Empire would have to measure all future resistance. Fear finally replaced certainty. The dread was not rooted in superstition nor in rumor. It was a direct product of disciplined observation. Every report, every diary entry, every dispatch chronicled the same pattern: relentless precision, adaptability under fire, and unbreakable coordination. They were a force that could not be intimidated, outmaneuvered, or counted out. And in that acknowledgement, the psychological dominance of the Marine Corps was complete. They were underestimated once. They were never underestimated again.